kind of compiling some of the information from the survey, and then we started going through the results and compiling the results from the breakout sections, the research agenda questions and topics. Went really well, lots of compliments, some good activities have been spurred from that. Marcy is also actively working on the website. We've got a big dump of pictures from the photographer we had, and we're going to get those on there. And we are kind of the next website lined up for to be developed at Perry. So we are starting on that process, and that should be up fairly soon, which is exciting because we'll be able to post some more things and have access to, you can refer individuals to it. People can see your bios if you're a member, all those good things to help publicize the work we're doing here. But that's enough about me. You did not come to listen to me whatsoever. You came to hear Esther present. Esther is going to present some information on flooding and how flooding could be impacting everything that we've done to meet food security needs. I was telling her before everybody got on, I have been impacted really by two. And 2000 and I think it was 16, we had a huge flood in Baton Rouge, 20 some odd inches over a 24-hour period, where the East Baton Rouge parish was essentially devastated. And then being from Kentucky, the flooding that occurred in the eastern part of the states and people not understanding how it floods in a mountain. Well, you build all those houses in the bottom of valleys and they collect a lot of water because the water doesn't have anywhere to run off from. Well, with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Esther. If you have questions you kind of want to ask, type them in the chat, or we'll be able to ask them at the end. So I'm going to mute and turn my video off and turn it over to Esther.
Okay, thank you so much. And everyone see my slides, okay?
Yes, you can hear you. You're good.
Okay.
See the slides.
Okay. Okay, thank you once again to everyone who has come in and managed to squeeze in their lunchtime, their spring break time. For those of us at UIUC, I know we are having our spring break to come and listen about flooding. And today I will talk about if, and I'm asking the question, could flooding erase progress made in building climate resilient crops and undermine efforts to meet food security needs? And I am an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I'm a trained entomologist, got my PhD from Auburn University in Alabama, and I'm also chaired by Entomology and African American Studies department here at UIUC. Okay. Okay, just before I begin, I would love to first of all thank my collaborators, funding agency, and students who have contributed in just unmeasurable number of times, and I couldn't have done this work without them. First of all, I would love to thank Angela Kent and Fred Bilo, who are my collaborating professors. We are working together on this USDA-funded field project that's investigating flooding. Dr. Connor Siebel, who is also a crop physiologist, a postdoc, who has an amazing knowledge about the fields, and definitely flooding work, especially in the field, could not have gone without him. I would also like to again thank my students, particularly last year we were in the fields, summertime, and for those of you who have been in the cornfields during the heat of the summer, you would testify to just, it takes a different kind of a person, and my students were those people, and I really, really appreciate them. And just as we all know, there's been a lot of significant investments that have been channeled towards developing climate resilient crops, rebuilding soil health. All of this is being done to improve our crop productivity, allowing us to meet our food security needs, and particularly so in a very variable climate. And it has taken diverse fields, partnerships, stakeholders, industries, researchers, government organizations, NGOs, civil society. It's truly a partnership across the government to all the way to the society. It has taken a lot of dollars have been poured into allowing us to meet these food security needs. And as a result, today we are capable of meeting our food security needs thanks to plant breeding, for example, that has allowed us to have high yielding crops that are capable of withstanding biotic and abiotic climate threats, including drought, insect herbivory, plant pathogens, and diseases. At the same time, too, because of all these efforts, we've rebuilt our soil health, and as a result, soils are teaming up with billions of beneficial soil microbes, whose role in underpinning both crop productivity, soils and plants resilience has been shown by numerous researchers over the decade. We've also built infrastructure that has allowed farmers to get out in the field and do what they've done over millions of years to feed our growing population. However, I would like to say, to mention that this progress that we've made to date, I think could or stands to be erased by flooding. Which is an emerging climate threat that negatively impacts crop production, human health, soil health, and every type of health. Flooding does impact, and as a result, impacts our national economy, as well as all the efforts that have gone towards meeting food security needs. And these pictures that just give you a glimpse of what flooding can do. From the left, you are capable of seeing just a flooded cornfield. You can see the crops that are growing in the flooded soil. They're not doing well. They're yellowing, stunted. The other picture is a soybean field, again decimated by flooding. So whatever crop is grown, we know that flooding detrimentally impacts its growth capabilities. And for those of us who have lived in the Midwest in the US, and record-breaking flooding events have continued to increase in recent years in intensity, frequency. And this is being documented not only in North America, it is across all the continents, including Africa. That's the continent I am from. Just recently, the entire California, a lot of crop growing regions were under flooding. And for those of us who live in the Midwest, 2019, I came to Illinois in 2018, and I was out in the farms looking at just crop growing, and when 2019 came, I still remember just how it was so different, and the flooding events it was really an event just to be reckoned with. And in the United States, as a result of flooding events, thousands and billions of dollars lost to that. Just taking us a step back to 2019, this is a flooding event that I actually witnessed. And as a result, to say, there is a lot of research out there that show that there's a lot of billions of dollars that were recorded across the US Midwest states, and also people were impacted. And it was just something to reckon with. But we know that all the climate change models are predicting a future where record-breaking flooding events will continue to be a thing. They will increase in frequency and intensity. And the big question becomes, are farmers, ranchers, state and federal government, and all stakeholders, including we, the researchers, prepared to respond to this future? The other question I would like to pose today is, are today's high-yielding agricultural crop varieties capable of withstanding the projected frequent flooding events? The answer, probably some of you are already aware, is going to be a no. And surprisingly, despite this increasing wave of flooding events, compared to other climate threats such as drought, to date, we know very little about flooding. And most importantly, I think flooding has not been investigated as it relates to its impacts on agriculturally relevant crops, including corn, soybean, the big crops that we grow here in Midwest. And all of these crops are important for meeting food security needs, which is a pillar of national security. And this was a research paper that was published under Global Change Biology that actually very well quantified that excessive rainfall and flooding events may lead to yield losses in maize that are comparable in magnitude to extreme drought. But again, as I say, we know very little about how flooding impacts agriculturally relevant crops. And before I begin just talking about its impacts, it's important that I define flooding in agriculture means. We're talking about it's either waterlogging or soil flooding, where parts of our plants are underwater. So it's not the entire plant, and mostly it's the root zone that is flooded. On the other hand, we have submergence, where the entire plant, both root and shoot, are underwater. And depending on the extremity of flooding event, we can have both of these terms. And what we know, when flooding happens, the main stressor at that moment is the deprivation of oxygen. When flooding happens, flooding quickly deprives soils and plant roots of oxygen and dramatically changes the soil matrix by which where plants are growing. Oxygen is an essential element, and without which plants are unable to perform all the critical life-sustaining processes, from water uptake to photosynthesis to respiration. Basically, and the entire plant-driven processes almost come to an halt. As a result of this altered plant physiology, metabolism, the growth and development of plant is negatively impacted with far-reaching consequences, both above ground and below ground. And what is just important is that once flooding happens, the impacts do not just stop after flooding events have receded. The research that has been done clearly indicates that all the impacts, these consequences linger on, affecting ability of crops to grow, and ultimately the yields are impacted. We also know from the little research that has been done to date that most of the agricultural crops and varieties that are grown today are intolerant to flooding. And when flooding happens, losses of up to 100% have been recorded. And this is very clear. We've done in my lab, we've done a lot of phenotyping experiments with looking at the different crop and varieties that are grown today. And it is clear, actually 3 days, 4 days, 5 days after flooding, most of these crops start to just wither out and die. So indeed, there is a need to understand flooding. And as I said, when I came to Illinois, and especially 2019 was a big year to me, walking around the farms, talking with my farmer friends, it was clear that I was going to focus somehow my research on understanding flooding. And part of my research back at Auburn, I worked with drought. So coming back, I was like, wow. When I saw the flooding impacts, especially just looking at the crops just completely die off, I was very inspired to work on flooding. And so my lab actually does a lot of flooding research, and this includes both greenhouse and field experiments. And most importantly, we are investigating the effects of flooding on corn and tomato when it happens individually and in combination with other biotic and abiotic stressors such as insect apiary. As I said, I'm a trained entomologist, as well as elevated temperature and many other stressors that can happen concurrently. And furthermore, my lab is further interested in investigating and understanding when flooding happens. What does it do to the web of soil microbiome that is so important for plant resilience? How is it impacted by flooding? And also, how is soil health and soil quality and functioning impacted by flooding? And as I said, since 2019, we've embarked on a few studies that specifically look at flooding. And in one of those studies, we investigated how flooding would impact corn plant growth. We had two varieties, one marketed for conventional production and the other one for organic, and looked at when we flooded the plants for a duration of 7 days, what did it do? As expected, it was clear that one, flooding impacts the development. In the graph, as you can see, flooded plants were half the weight of the normal healthy growing plants. So again, we saw a very significant difference in their growth biomass, as well as plant chemistry, which is also important for mediating interactions among plant associating communities. And in another study that we looked at tomato, further investigating what flooding does to tomato plant growth, physiology, and most importantly also genetics and of flooding. And similarly to the previous study with corn, we found same results. And remember, I've said previous research has shown that agricultural crops of today are not tolerant to flooding. And we've seen that across the experiments we have done, corn and tomato. And most importantly, it was clear for this study, we saw that flooding further impacts plant defense capabilities. It downregulated all general plant defense capabilities. And this is important because if flooding is doing that, after flooding events, it means that you're left with not only crops that are not developing normally, but crops that are also weak and can not be able to defend themselves against other stressors that may come after flooding events have occurred. In another recent study that we did in my lab, further understanding again the impact of flooding on corn. But in this study, we are also looking, can we look at some of the older varieties, the wild varieties that we know have been shown to be flooding tolerant. And in so doing, if we understand the physiological and genetic mechanisms that underpin these flooding tolerant varieties, then we can begin to bring all this knowledge to plant breeding and ensure that plant breeders of today are including these genetic qualities to modern varieties. And in this study too, when we compared between a wild variety of maize and modern maize, it was clear again the modern maize growth and development was impacted, and you can see both shoot these are growth biomass indicators. We also looked at the metabolome because root metabolites are important in recruiting the web of beneficial soil microbes around the soils that further allow plants to grow better and to also defend themselves against biotic and abiotic stresses. Again, in this result, we found the same result. Flooding impacts corn. More importantly, the newer varieties cannot withstand corn. We found differences again in the metabolites, and especially too the metabolites associated with plant defense were impacted, which further again begins to we need to ask more questions. What does that mean if flooded plants after flooding has receded are weak, not growing normally? That may further impact everything and ultimately yields. And concurrently with the greenhouse experiments, we are doing a 2-year field flooding field experiment. We already did 2023 a full-fledged single and double flooding, and in the right you see this aerial view of the picture that was taken in our maize fields. You can almost see the plots that were flooded. So flooding carries on, and this was flooding done at 2 weeks after plants were grown, and then later on at V8, and you can clearly see just from above the impacts of flooding carry on. We are just beginning to summarize the data from 2023, so stay tuned, but it is clear, yes, we saw a big impact of flooding under fields on crop growth and productivity, and also on the yields. So we also looked at the yields, and we also looked at the grain quality, and again, this clearly it's revealing that yes, these impacts of flooding are detrimental. And we're also looking at the below ground soil microbiome, so stay tuned to our research results that will uncover what flooding did both above ground and below ground. And we are not only alone. Our results are actually mirroring other scholars' results that have shown that yes, flooding does negatively impact crop growth and yields. We have a group actually, I think in Missouri, that is doing a lot of good work on flooding, and they've similarly shown results similar to ours. And across the crops, our big crops, corn, soybean, wheat as well. What also the research is showing is that there are many factors that actually can impact the flooding impacts. And these include soil type, quality, the management history under which the soil has been managed, whether it's organic and organic, conventional production, the crop species, the genotype, phenological stage when flooding happens. Soil temperature as well can actually accelerate the impacts of flooding on crops, as well as flooding duration, whether it's flooding for a whole week, a whole month, all of that further can shape the outcome of flooding impacts. I've talked about what flooding does above ground. But what about soils? And especially so to the beneficial wave of soil-dwelling microorganisms that have been shown to be so important. And because over the past decade, there's been a lot of billions of dollars that have been poured in efforts to rebuild soil health. And just like I shared with above ground plant crop growth, these gains could be wiped away by flooding. And the reason being, flooding fundamentally alters the soil matrix, including changing both soil physical and chemical characteristics, which govern microbial activities. And we know to date, there's a lot of money out there and a lot of just amazing regenerative practices that farmers are taking upon, from cover cropping to no-tilling. And as a result, we've built these healthy soils. The question is, could all these gains be wiped away? And the answer is perhaps yes. And for reasons being the few studies, and we don't have a lot of studies that have gone into understanding what flooding exactly does to soil microbes. But we have a few researchers out there that have shown that, yes, flooding does impact soil health, does impact soil microbial communities. And again, during flooding, in response to the rapidly declining oxygen levels, the soil environment as it is undergoes drastic changes. And from an environment that operates under oxygen to an environment where oxygen is not available. So soil pH, nutrient concentrations, everything about soil changes. And as it changes too, microorganisms, the ones that depend on oxygen, have to rapidly change. And as a result, we have anaerobic microbial communities, as well as the accumulation of toxic elements such as manganese, iron, hydrogen sulfide, all of which can harm native soil microbial communities. The few studies that have been done reveal that flooding results into shifts in microbial communities. And most importantly, the studies have documented that most of these plant beneficial microbial groups are depleted by flooding. And as that is going on, we have a sudden increase in the abundance of pathogenic microbes. Soil quality, health, and functioning is dramatically impacted. We have increases in nutrient losses, greenhouse gas emissions, elemental cycling is disrupted. And not only are the beneficial soil microbes being impacted, also other soil-dwelling organisms such as earthworms are impacted. In fact, there's a study which showed that flooding eliminated earthworms, and it took time for them to recover. So it's clearly that, yes, while we know very little, soils and soil microbes are impacted by flooding. And it's clear that some of these investments that have gone into rebuilding soil health could be at risk. Furthermore, what we don't know is, as shared in building soil health, we have all these regenerative practices. But the question is, when flooding happens, do they help or do they become an impediment to these impacts? So those are questions that at the moment we do not know. At the same time, what are the long-term consequences of flooding when these drastic changes in microbial communities happen? Do they rebuild back? What time what are the timescales that it takes to rebuild this soil, microbial, and organisms that have been built over the past decade. So as I wind my talk, I think I'm coming back to ask the same question that I asked. Could flooding erase the progress that has been made in building climate resilient crops? I think from the results of my research and the research of other scholars, it is clear that yes, it can. And because, as shared, most of our crop varieties that are growing today are clearly flooding intolerant. And we need to ensure that we are breeding for varieties that can, because this is the future that's being projected, that we'll have the repeat of 2019 flooding events again and again and again, and they can happen throughout the season cycle. I think moving forward, there's a lot of good work or research that can be done. First of all, I think breeding pipelines need to incorporate flooding because it is here, it is going to be common. And while we've bred for drought and other climate-associated threats, clearly we've not bred for flooding. There's need for short and long-term studies that are investigating the impact of flooding on agriculturally relevant crops, as well as soils. We also, I think it's time to prepare flooding in agriculture preparedness plan. I think whenever it happens, we all seem to be so proactive, only acting then, and after flooding events are over, we go back to normal. But if this is a future that is coming, I think it is important that we develop these preparedness plans. What can farmers do to increase resilience and so that when flooding happens, we do not have to lose all the crops? And I know part of the project that we are doing, we're investigating adding nitrogen, because farmers do apply rescue nitrogen. Does it help? Can we also incorporate other sustainable approaches and innovations? Also, as I said, there's a lot of buildup of soil, toxic soil elements. How can we change that? But most importantly, I think also infrastructure. I think part of farming today, the machinery that we have cannot. And I was in a flooding field. I can tell you, especially in Illinois and Midwest with our soil, the clay, the soil that we have, it is difficult. We were getting stuck in the flooding field. It is just something. And so we need innovations with infrastructure. And I think not only just we need to prepare just nationwide preparedness plans. I think it's time that we start to investigate the impacts flooding has on agriculturally relevant crops, including those grown by specialty farmers. I think throughout the many years we've seen, especially when flooding happens, specialty farmers who do not have insurance to cover their farming enterprises can really be impacted. And sometimes, especially because of food safety issues, when flooding happens, most of the time, if you're growing crops that are edible, such as tomatoes, you cannot sell those crops because of FDA regulations. I think as I end, it's just time to invest, to start thinking of how we have a Midwest hub and center that's dedicated to investigating flooding and its impacts on agriculture. And more importantly, I think bringing all the stakeholders together, from industries to researchers like myself, to government, and everyday citizen, and farmers, most importantly, to start to develop these preparedness plans and response for flooding in agriculture, particularly flooding in agriculture. And I think it's more relevant to America's heartland. We are the leading producer of corn, soybeans, and wheat. And we must stay ahead of this emerging climate threat, which is not only a threat to food production, food security, as well as national security. So thank you very much, and I will take questions.
Esther, so I think you have a question from Scott here in the chat that says, what if we could generate more interest in watershed-wide soil health improvement? We have a model that shows it may be possible to reduce flood flow by 8%. So Scott, if you have some more you want to add on to that, we can, Marcy can kind of take you off mute, but Esther, if you have some comments about that, and I think feel free to make those comments.
I think every innovation helps, but at this point, I think we have to think or address this flooding issue through multiple lenses, through multiple fields and stakeholders. So I think, yes, every innovation, every solution goes a long way to helping prepare, as well as ensure that should a flooding event happen, we know what to do. We have solutions, the innovations, and everything. So thanks for that point.
Then Scott has another comment. Won't the foundation of the soils also negatively impact the biological symbiotic benefits in the soil, not just the plant physiology?
I think yes, and we are beginning to understand that at the field level. So we've done a lot of this previous work in the greenhouse, but I think the big test is in the field. But yeah, when flooding happens, it's impacting everything. So not only between just even the bacterial, the microbial communities interactions, but also as well as the plant relationship with these microbial communities. So it's, as I showed, it's basically the soil matrix and all the normal functioning of soil rules just come to a drastic stop, and everyone has to, including the microorganisms, have to shift to anaerobic respiration, metabolism, and functioning. And not all of these soil dwelling organisms are equipped to that. And so again, it's, yeah, flooding impacts every kind of interactions in the soil matrix.
All right, very good. You're getting lots of questions here, so that's good. Everett asks, what are the implications of flooding on consequence planting season? And if anybody wants to chat or ask a question, please let us know and we can take you off mute, or if you have more to add to the conversation. We do want as much active participation as possible.
I think that's also a good question, and we haven't also investigated the legacy impacts, which I did not mention, and we know they're there. We know there's these lingering effects of flooding. What happens in the next year, in the next years to come? And that's why I'm calling for actually long-term studies that investigate this. The few studies, I know there's a study out of Europe that showed that some of these flooding-related changes stay and can stay for up to 10 years down the lane. How that impacts everything that we know, we still don't know. As I said, flooding compared to all these other beautiful studies with drought and other threats, we do not know much about flooding. Hence, the need to understand what are those lingering effects, and how should they then also affect or inform, how do farmers, either it's whether you're dressing your field, how does that factor in? How should thinking of last year's flooding effects help a farmer factor in what nutrients they need to put in the soil? How are they going to actually use their agricultural inputs, and so on and so forth? And does it impact the next year's yields, and so on and so on? We actually do not have those long-term studies.
I'm going to ask a question, Scott, since you asked about flood flow, and Esther, you might know. How much, and I don't know if anybody even knows the answer, how much does are we doing work in the ag field with like the Army Corps of Engineers to help manage some of these flood issues? Scott, I'm gonna take you off mute so you can. Oh, I thought I did. Sorry, Marcy, you may have to unmute Scott there. I think I may have muted him back. So that's an interesting that's a question I have, because I think we deal with that here in Louisiana where we had flooding. So I think Scott, you should be you should be unmuted.
Yeah, I'd be glad to kind of give you some insight. I've actually been working with the Corps of Engineers for the last few years, because what we've determined is there's a potential for us to use the hydrologic model that the Corps uses, but instead of using the standard SCS runoff curve, and instead of using the hydrologic group, which both are kind of outdated. And when we look through Kansas soil survey, 2.5 inches per hour of infiltration rate is the best drainage of the hydrologic group A. I've got regenerative ag guys who are doing 8 inches per hour of infiltration. They got 4% organic matter. And so when this model that I talked about, so the Corps is really starting to look at this on the basis of how do we look at watershed management in its entirety instead of just building levees and dams. And part of the reason for that is because FEMA is starting to look at using building resilience and community FEMA type of process where they use co-benefits now. And so your cost benefit analysis can actually include things like restoring wetlands or, protecting riparian forests or whatever the case is. In our state, a lot of what we see is people don't want those kind of things around their community. But if we can put that watershed wide soil health up above that community, then we think that that's a much better opportunity. And the other thing that it does, these communities don't have the ability to pay for the kind of levees and dams and all these kind of structural measures, and they don't have the money to put up to buy out property. And so when they come up against these big mitigation projects, they can't cost out. Well, this is the way we think that they could be able to compete with those, because the money that they would receive would go up in the watershed and pay the farmers for what they're worth in their ability to soak the soil up. We've got one guy who's doing 21 inches per hour of infiltration rate now because he has improved his soil health so much. He's got 22% organic matter. It's unheard of. But at the same time, this is the same gentleman that I've worked with for quite a while, and he told me 15 years ago when he started this, he said he used to just conventional farm, and this tributary next to his farm was either dry or wet, never hardly flowed. But this field has been changed so much, he actually sees a perennial flow now in that tributary. So the water is going down and into the geological material and into the base flow as it's meant to be, instead of just sitting there up on top. And as for the reason why I kind of asked the question is because one of the things we've seen, and I'd like to see more study done on this, not just the impacts of the flooding on the soil, but how long can the water stay on the soil and still not negatively impact the biology. And if anybody's interested, I can put a link to our Kansas Healthy Watersheds. We've got the tech report, we've got the model. We actually used field data, which was organic matter and infiltration rate. There's a coefficient that the Corps used that will formulate into the model porosity and KSAT. Those two metrics are much easier to put into a hydrologic model. And that's where we came up with a 10,000 acre watershed. We had 50% of that watershed was improved soil health. So we doubled the infiltration rate in the organic matter. Over 50% of the watershed, we came up with that 8%. I can put a link in and people can look through that if they're interested.
Yes, please. That'd be great. Thank you, Scott.
Mhm.
Yeah, please share that. And then Jackie has a question here. Will resilience / recovery from flooding in different locations or conditions require site-specific solutions? And if so, what near-term assessments will need to be done?
So yeah, that's an important question. Yes, resilience to flooding is definitely dependent on. It will depend on many factors, including the location, the soil type, and the soil management history under which these soils have been managed, the crops, the temperatures. So there are many factors that definitely are to take into consideration when you're thinking about resilience. So yes, that's going to be. We need studies also to be able to uncover all of that, and that's why I think it's important to just have long-term field experience that's spread across the United States, and again, because we know that flooding will become a thing throughout the United States. We saw it in California, and so for all the agricultural the states that are growing agricultural crops that are so important to meeting our food security needs, I think it will be important to start uncovering that. I think later on, I think we are going to start working on experiments that compare different soil types and to investigate what does that mean. But I think more field work is where these studies need to be done. But of course, we can utilize modeling. I think modeling can start to begin to uncover some of those patterns, but modeling should also be combined with actual field work to begin to understand all this, what it takes to be resilient. And yes, nobody, there's so little research about all of these things and important questions. I'm hoping that, we can have even some network of researchers across the United States that are actively looking into all of this. And I'm happy to talk with anyone and to start building that network.
Jackie, did you have anything you wanted to add to that at all, or questions? Oh, yep, there she is.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Just thinking about how all of those things that were mentioned, Esther mentioned just now, are going to vary, and whether we'd have the ability to make generalizations or whether we would have to do some specific kinds of assessments for risk and the types of management strategies that would be needed. Would there be situations where we'd have to do those assessments immediately on site in a response reaction like FEMA or EPA or those kinds of responders?
So, Jackie, let me see if I can. I'm seeing what you're asking. You're asking really is, does there need to be some type of immediate response team that goes out there and does some work?
Yeah,
when one of these events occurs.
Right. That's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
I think yes. I think definitely there's a need for that. I think any data that can be done at moments when like we have flooding events, I think definitely just getting all those data at that moment is important. So that will allow for these site-specific kind of assessments, and it will go towards building these risk assessments and preparedness plans that are that take into consideration, I think, all these geographical locations, soil factors, the weather of that state, and so on.
Right. Just also wanted to say great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you to everybody that's asked questions. And then I'm going to ask one more. And then if anybody else has anything, and I am not a soil scientist, a plant scientist, an agronomist, a horticulturist, any of those bench sciences related to plants. That's not my area of expertise, but I am curious when we're working on plants and working on soils and we're breeding some plants to be, obviously a lot of times flooding doesn't get the attention that maybe droughts do, but does that create an issue when you're trying to develop a plant that is not only drought tolerant, but then also to turn around and try to make it flood tolerant? Does that create a lot of competing genetic issues there within the plant breeding space? And then I'll be quiet because it was just a question I had there.
Definitely, and I'm not a plant breeder, but I would think there would be trade-offs. But I think we are expanding in the technological aspects, and it could be just a way of having a gene that's silent and only activated when flooding, say, happens. So I think we are at the edge where we can incorporate all sorts of genes and genetic architecture in our germplasm, and probably it might be difficult, but I think we should be able to have at least genes that only are activated. And I think it shouldn't take on space, but could be turned on when flooding happens. But definitely there are two different types of stressors. As I said, flooding technically, it is no oxygen, so it's a different kind of a stressor, completely different from drought. So it might take a lot, and that's hopefully in the future plant breeding and the teams can incorporate that. And I don't know what it will take because I'm not a breeder, but I think it should be able to be possible.
Very, very good. Very good. Esther, if you want to put your email there in the chat in case people want to reach out to you, that would be really good. I know it's in the presentation. As I said earlier, Marcy and I are working diligently. Marcy more so than me. She's the brains here on this, getting the website up and running so these presentations will be available. We do want to continue to put out call. We'll send an email out later that if you are interested in making a webinar presentation, we'd love to have you. We're really trying to get some people from the public health sector. If you think you have somebody that's looked into the impacts that food and ag disasters have on public health, we would love to get a couple people speaking on that. I know I spoke last week at the Kentucky Extension Conference, and that was an item that they brought up that public health was really affected, including mental health could also be an impact of that. So if you could have somebody, if you have anybody in mind, feel free to send them on. Esther, thank you so much for presenting. We enjoyed having it. We enjoyed getting the opportunity to listen, and thank you to everybody for the questions. Scott, thank you for the leak as well. Jackie, and for your questions too. We hope everyone has a wonderful Friday, and as we go into the weekend, we hope you enjoy your weekend. If you're a college basketball fan, this is probably one of the most exciting weekends and weeks coming up. So hope everyone has a wonderful day and weekend, and thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.